Welcome. My name is Ann Hemmons. I am your presenter, and you are here for the Tracing Federal Regulations webinar. I am a senior legal reference librarian here at the Law Library of Congress. And as I said, I will be presenting slides here today, and my colleague Jason will be assisting me with tech issues along the way. As you see on the screen, we've posted some information to help you navigate this Zoom webinar. As it states, we ask that you submit questions through the Q&A feature. To use the feature, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, input your question, and click send. If you're having trouble with your computer audio, we suggest using the call-in feature. To stop using computer audio, click the up arrow next to mute, unmute, then click leave computer audio. Then click phone call and follow the prompt to dial in. And do please ensure that you're muted if you use that option. And this session is being recorded. If you choose to participate by submitting questions, for example, any of your comments or questions will become part of the library's collections. After the webinar, we will make the slides and a link to the recording of the webinar, assuming we have no technical difficulties, available via an email from the library. Okay, so welcome again to Tracing Federal Regulations webinar. This is part of the Law Library's Orientation to Legal Research webinar series, which is designed to give you a basic introduction to legal sources and research techniques. These orientations are offered once a month on a rotating basis. The other two in the series are the U.S. Case Law webinar. We should have one in April, and the U.S. Federal Statutes webinar later in the spring. Please visit our Legal Research Institute website to sign up. The website address is law.gov, and then click on Legal Research Institute. I will try to do my best to leave time at the end of this 1-hour webinar to answer your questions. Again, please submit any questions through the Q&A box in Zoom. So today we are talking about U.S. federal regulations, or the rules promulgated by U.S. federal agencies. Rules and regulations are created by a federal body, such as an agency, board, or commission, and they explain how that body intends to carry out or administer a federal law. In this presentation, I'll be using the words rules and regulations interchangeably as synonyms. Okay, let's begin. I like to start webinars by giving everyone a roadmap of where we're going during the presentation. So first, I'm going to give you a very basic overview of the federal regulatory process. How are federal executive branch bodies, such as agencies, boards, or commissions, able to make law via regulations? And what processes do they have to follow to do so? Next, I'm going to talk about the steps involved in promulgating or creating a rule, particularly what needs to be published in the two main federal publications containing regulations, which are the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. And we will talk about what order this publication process must follow. Finally, the bulk of this presentation will be in figuring out how to trace a regulation from its final form in the Code of Federal Regulations back to its formative stages, processes in the Federal Register, and finally back to its agency docket, which contains the files related to the creation and promulgation of a rule. So let's get started. Here on the screen, you have examples of two regulations. Regulations affect many aspects of our daily lives, and we might not realize it. Just by way of example, here are two such federal regulations. On the left, we see a regulation from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. The regulation deals with requirements for gluten-free labeling of food, as found in, happens to be 21 C.F.R. 101.91. More specifically, we see this provision includes definitions for words or terms that are used in that regulation, including what the labeling claim of, quote, gluten-free means. On the right side of the screen, we see a regulation from the Federal Aviation Administration, which is within the Department of Transportation. This regulation deals with what portable electronic devices may or may not be operated when on a U.S. civil aircraft. Back when we were traveling much more frequently, you may recall hearing an audio announcement when on a plane, usually provided before the plane takes off or lands, about turning off devices. Well, this regulation includes an exception, and this we're looking at is 14 CFR 91.21. Now, let's move on to talking about what administrative bodies do. Because the US Congress and its members in the House of Representatives and the Senate cannot be experts on all the details of all things, Congress will often pass a law, which you may also hear me call an act or a statute, that provides a general directive, the broad strokes. And within that law, it grants an administrative body or agency the regulatory authority to issue detailed rules and regulations designed to implement that law. For example, the US Congress passes a law such as the Clean Air Act, in which they declare that the increase in air pollution is posing a danger to public health, agriculture, and property, and that they want to do something to help reduce and prevent air pollution. So within the act, they delegate the authority to an executive branch agency, such as the US Environmental Protection Agency, to create the detailed and specific rules or regulations to implement the law. The result is the creation of regulations such as those related to air quality standards for air pollutant emissions. So the initial law, the Clean Air Act in our case, is called the Enabling or Authority Statute because it gave the executive agency the authority to act. In other words, the law is authorizing or enabling the agency to create the regulations to put that law into action. There are largely two reasons that Congress would delegate this authority to agencies. One, an agency has a particular subject matter expertise on a topic or issue addressed by the statute. For example, the Department of Labor would be expected to have extensive knowledge about labor and employment issues. And or the US Congress wants to provide a mechanism for the law to be more easily adapted and respond to change, since federal regulations can often be updated more quickly than federal statutes. But despite these positives, Congress realized that agencies are not headed by elected officials and that the regulatory process may not be very transparent and not uniform. So they passed the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946. It is often just referred to as the APA. The goals of the APA were to require increased openness about agency organization, procedure, and rules, allow for increased participation by the public in the rulemaking process, and to ensure that agency procedures follow uniform standards. So let's talk a little bit about rules and regulations produced by administrative bodies. Agency rules and regulations carry the force of law as long as they follow the standards laid out by statute, including the processes laid out in the APA. There are a few types of rules that are exempted from these requirements for increased openness, including rules regarding procedure and the interpretation of regulatory language, policy statements, and rules related to a military or foreign affairs function, or where public procedure is impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. But almost all other rulemaking processes fall under the notice and comment rulemaking process, also called the informal rulemaking process, which is covered by the APA. And this is the process we will focus on today. Here we are looking at a notice and comment rulemaking process chart. On the top of the screen, you see the 6 steps of the chart. And we are going to start the process at the top and work our way to the bottom. But before we start with step 1, I want to mention the big picture, the overview. In the fall of each year, an agency gives everyone notice of their regulatory priorities for the year and information on the most significant regulatory activity planned for the upcoming year. They publish this as the agency's regulatory plan. The regulatory plan is combined with information about the agency's current regulatory and deregulatory activities called the Unified Agenda. which is published on a semi-annual basis by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget, often called OMB, which is within the Executive Office of the President. All right, now back to the chart. At the top, we see the first step in this process is that the agency drafts the proposed rule or regulation, also called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, and publishes it in the Federal Register, asking the public to comment on it. Typically, this proposed rule publication includes background information, description of the rule's purpose, legal basis, etc. The Federal Register, which we'll learn about today, is a daily publication put out every day the government is working. There's not an explicit amount of time that agencies have to accept comments, but it is typically set at 30 to 90 days, and it is sometimes expanded for additional time if a rule is getting a lot of attention. This is done by publishing an extension notice in the Federal Register. The agency reviews these comments, takes these into account, and drafts a final rule. The final rule is published in the Federal Register, giving a general statement of the basis and purpose, and addressing the comments in a general fashion and how they responded to those comments. All the new rules or amendments to existing rules, etc., made by the final rule are then incorporated into the publication called the Code of Federal Regulations, or C.F.R. for short. The C.F.R. is published in print and free online, and is updated annually, and we'll be talking about it today. Before we go on, you can see the asterisks on step 1 and 4 in the chart. They indicate that if a proposed or final rule is considered a significant regulatory action under Executive Order 12866, it must be reviewed by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Management and Budget before being published. We could do a whole class on what is considered a significant regulatory action, but it's largely referring to regulations that might have an over $100 million effect on the economy. As you saw on the prior chart, publication is a critical part of the informal notice and comment rulemaking process. I briefly mentioned the two major publications in this federal rulemaking process. We'll discuss both of them in more detail later in the presentation, but I want to explain the main differences between the two now. The Federal Register is where you will find proposed rules, also called NPRMs, any notices, like those extending a comment period, and final rules. It is published almost every business day and is set up chronologically. So think of the Federal Register as a snapshot of what agencies are doing on a certain day, without any consideration of the topics involved or where the rules are in the regulatory process. There are additional things published in the Federal Register, such as notices of agency meetings or hearings about a rule that members of the public may want to attend. Executive orders from the President and more are included in the Federal Register. In contrast, the Code of Federal Regulations, or C.F.R., is the collection of all the regulations currently in force and organized by subject. All new rules will be added to the C.F.R. as it is updated annually in print. So changed rules will be removed or amended as appropriate, and new rules will be added in. Think of the C.F.R. as a snapshot of all the current regulations in force at a given time, organized by subject matter. For example, all the regulations about labor or working from the Department of Labor are in one place. So to summarize, the Code of Federal Regulations is a resource that shows all the regulations that are in effect at its time of publication, whereas the Federal Register is simply a chronological publication showing the regulatory actions of all administrative bodies as they are happening on a daily basis. All right, so let's piece this together and walk through how to trace a regulation from its final form in the C.F.R. back to the proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, and then further back to the docket, or the agency's collection of documents produced during the rulemaking process. We're going to walk through each of these 4 steps of a research strategy for regulations. We will start with a citation to a regulation in the C.F.R. because typically that is where our questions begin. We have a citation that we will use in our webinar today. We're going to look at 29 C.F.R. 1630.1. If you don't know what that citation means, don't worry, we'll be talking about that in a minute. These regulations deal with implementing the equal employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next, we'll find the regulation in the C.F.R. and look to the notes to determine further information. First, to find what statutory provision has granted authority to the agency to create this regulation. We will use the authority note to find the enabling or authority statute. And we'll use the source notes to find the final rules that created and then amended the C.F.R. section of interest to us, as they were originally published in the Federal Register. Finally, we'll use identifying numbers we find in the preamble to the final rule in the Federal Register to find the notice of proposed rulemaking and its related docket information, which will lead us to materials such as public comments, related agency reports, transcripts of town hall meetings, etc. Okay, I brought back the chart with 6 steps in the notice and comment rulemaking process, again called informal rulemaking, but I reversed it. At the top of the screen, you will see that we are beginning our research at the end of the regulation publication process. We are starting with the currently enforced regulation as found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or C.F.R. Then we'll work backwards, all the way to when the first proposed rule was published in the Federal Register. To make your way through regulations research, it's important to first understand the structure of the C.F.R. The C.F.R. is organized by subject matter, and it is hierarchical in structure. It's divided into 50 numbered titles based on large general subject areas like energy, agriculture, or labor. Each title is then divided into chapters, typically named after the administrative body promulgating or making the regulations. These chapters are then divided into parts and subparts based on more specific subject areas, narrowing down into sections. And the section is sometimes called the basic unit of the C.F.R. So I like to think of the C.F.R. as an idea funnel, starting with big picture ideas at the top and narrowing through chapters, parts, and finally down to sections. And you are typically citing to a specific section. Let's explore a citation to a specific section in the C.F.R. Here's the citation for the C.F.R. section we're using today. And this citation follows the Blue Book citation system, which is a citation system used by lawyers in the US. Other citation systems you might have used in the past include Chicago or APA or MLA. Starting on the left, the first number you see is the title number. Let's see. Title 29, spoiler alert, that happens to deal with labor because that is what we are researching today. After the C.F.R. letters and the section symbol, which is that squiggly symbol, you will see 2 numbers separated by a period. The whole thing together is your section number, but you will notice that the first number before the period correlates to the part 1630, in which that section is found. And finally, you see the date of publication. Remember, the date is important because it is letting a researcher know that you are talking about the C.F.R. section as it appeared in the edition of the C.F.R. published in the year 2020. Remember, the C.F.R. is published annually, so the language could be different in prior or later years. The year in the parenthetical does not tell you when the regulation first came into existence. But by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to understand how to determine that. Unlike a lot of other publications that are published at one time, typically at the end of the year, the C.F.R. is published cyclically throughout the year based on the title number. As you see on the screen, there are 50 titles to the CFR, and they are divided into 4 groups. Group 1 is updated in January of each year. Group 2 is updated in April each year, and so on. Each yearly update gets a different colored spine on their printed volumes, so you can tell at a glance by looking at the bookshelves in your library how up-to-date your print collection of the CFR is. As it notes on the screen, the 2020 editions of the CFR have a hot pink color on their spine, but the 2019 volumes had a brown color on the spine, etc. So, okay. So now that we know what we are looking for, we need to find out how to actually find it. You can now find almost all of the editions of the CFR online for free. The Government Publishing Office, or GPO, is the official publisher of federal government documents. GPO has PDFs of all the print copies of the CFR from 1996 to the present time, available on its govinfo.gov website. We'll talk about the list of CFR sections affected and the e-CFR resources a bit later. For issues of the CFR from its first printing in 1938 up to 1996, where the GPO coverage begins, you can look to the Law Library of Congress's CFR webpage. We are in the midst of migrating all of our PDF copies of the print CFR, so we are still missing editions from the 1970s to the 1990s, but eventually, all copies of the CFR from its beginning in 1938 up to 1995 will be at that Library of Congress website you see on the screen. If you have access to subscription sources like those listed on the screen, including Hein Online, Westlaw, and Lexis, of course, please feel free to use those as well. Let's look at the govinfo.gov website from the U.S. Government Publishing Office. Here you see a screenshot, and you see that there are several options to get you your CFR section of interest. You can browse items by category. You can use an advanced search feature, and you can use a citation search if you know your exact CFR citation. And these are all highlighted on the screen in the orange boxes. And we'll take each of these in turn. So here we're considering the Browse by Category option on GovInfo. If you choose Browse by Category tab to locate regulations, I would suggest choosing the regulatory information from the list on the left side of the screen as highlighted. This will provide links to only regulatory resources, including the Code of Federal Regulations, the Federal Register, and more. When you choose the Code of Federal Regulations from the list, you will be sent to a landing page listing all the available CFR editions by year, browsable by title, chapter, part, and section number. If you do not have a citation to a specific section of the CFR and instead want to do a keyword or subject search, I strongly suggest using the Advanced Search tab on GovInfo, because if you do not, and you use the general, broad, Google-like one search box, you will get a lot of results, thousands of results probably. So the advanced search lets you choose what collection of material you want to search in. In our case, it would be the CFR. And you can see we've highlighted that with a checkbox. And you can limit to a date range, because as we saw, GovInfo has all the CFR editions back to the mid-1990s to the present. Once you select these things, just put your keyword in the search box and click Search. In our specific case, though, we've been given a citation, 29 CFR 1630.1. So we can use the Citation tab. To do so, simply select the resource being cited from the drop-down list provided, then select the date. If you don't know whether your title has been published in the current year, you can select Most Recent from the list, and GovInfo will determine that for you. Next, put your title number, in our case 29, and then the part, in our case 1630, and you can put the number after the period into the section box, in our case 1. So let's see what that looks like. This is an example of the search form completed. All of the information is input. So what are we looking at? This is our sample C.F.R. section that we retrieved from our citation search that we just completed for 29 C.F.R. section 1630.1. It's a PDF image. We're in Title 29 of the C.F.R. Starting at the top left of the screen, you see we are in Part 1630, Regulation to Implement the Equal Employment Provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Below that, in the orange square, is a table of contents for this part, listing the section numbers and their titles. Notice it ranges from section 1630.1 to 1630.16. And below that is our section 1630.1 with the title Purposes, Applicability, and Construction. It starts with subparagraph A and rolls over into the next column with subparagraph B, etc. Okay, this is a blow up of the language that's found in paragraph A within our section 1630.1, describing the purpose of the regulation. And again, the section continues on with paragraph B on the next page. Just wanted to give you an easier to read image of our particular C.F.R. section. Now, what if you wanted to use the Law Library of Congress online collection for searching or browsing? So we'll break down the information found in a section of the C.F.R. in more detail shortly. But before that, I just want to show you what the Law Library of Congress's collection looks like, in case you need to do that historical research before the 1990s. As mentioned earlier, it's a collection still in development. Currently, the materials from 1938, when the C.F.R. came into existence, until about the 1960s are available and will eventually have material up to 95. You can do a keyword search via the search box at the top of the screen, or browse by date range from the facets on the left side of the screen. And again, this collection is made up of individual PDFs of C.F.R. sections from print copies of the C.F.R., and they are all keyword searchable within the PDF itself by using the Find feature in Adobe Reader. Okay, what about updating our regulations? In our situation, we want to make sure that we have the most current version of our regulation at 29 C.F.R. 1630.1. Title 29 of the C.F.R. was most recently published on July 1, 2020, so we need to determine if any changes have been made to our C.F.R. section between July 1, 2020 and today. To do so, we use a resource or tool called the List of C.F.R. Sections Affected, otherwise commonly known as LSA. Now, this may be a little cumbersome to walk through, but we want to show it to you. Again, if you have questions about this, remember the law library is available for questions in the future using our Ask a Librarian source. On the slide, you see a screen capture from GPO's govinfo.gov website for the LSA. It is a cumulative list put out monthly that contains information about all of the proposed, new, and amended federal regulations that have been published in the Federal Register since the most recent revision date of all C.F.R. titles. The LSA is organized by title, chapter, and section number, so you simply turn to your title number to see if your section is listed. If your section is listed, that means that there is something that has been published in the Federal Register that likely affects your section. The entry will then list the page in the current volume of the Federal Register on which you find the item of interest, and you need to read it. To get to the LSA, simply use the govinfo.gov link I've given you on the screen or use the Browse by Category link I've showed you earlier. Let's look at the latest issue of LSA to see if there are any changes to our C.F.R. section. All right, on the left side of the screen is one image to focus on. We need to see if there have been any changes to our regulation since our C.F.R. title was published July 1, 2020. So we're using the list of sections affected, or LSA. We need to work through this two-step process. First, we are consulting the February 2021 edition of the LSA, which will capture any changes or new rules between the beginning of July 2020 through the end of February 2021. Look to that image on the left side of the screen. Note that not all sections are listed under our title. Again, that's because a section is only listed if it has been amended since the last publication of the C.F.R. And we've circled in red on the far left that there is no indication for section 1630 being there, which is a good sign. That means there have been no publications in the Federal Register impacting us during the time period covered by that LSA. All right, now we need step 2. We need to see if there have been any changes to our section promulgated between March 1, 2021 and today. To do that, we review the most recent issue of the Daily Federal Register and look in the Reader's Aid section at the end of the Federal Register volume for the cumulative list of C.F.R. parts affected during that month. So on the right side, you see a screen grab of the most recent Federal Register from we've got one that's dated today, March 18, and it's the C.F.R. parts affected during March, and you'll see circled in red the lack of our section 1630.1, which is good, meaning no changes for us to worry about. Okay. Again, if you have questions about how you use the LSA to update your research for the regulations in print, contact the Law Library. We'll be glad to help. All right, another option we have here is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. Now, if you don't have time to check the most recent published edition of the C.F.R. and then double check the language is still good using that list of sections affected or LSA, there is another resource you can use, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, simply called the e-CFR. The e-CFR is the most current online version of the C.F.R. It's updated daily. The data title was most recently changed due to an update from the Federal Register as seen in the last updated column. Remember, this is a compilation of the C.F.R. with any new final rules that were recently published in the Federal Register. It added and any old rules that were amended and then changed in this e-CFR represented. Eventually, this same language will be available in the print C.F.R. and the PDF version we were looking at a moment ago. Remember that print C.F.R. is updated once a year. You can browse by title number. We want Title 29 that contains regulations related to work or labor. You can also do a keyword search, maybe the phrase Americans with Disabilities Act, via the search button at the top left of the screen or the search e-CFR box at the top right. If you know your CFR section, you can use the Go to CFR reference box in the middle of the screen. I do want to point out that as it says on the e-CFR website, it is the unofficial version of the CFR. So why does that matter? If you're citing to CFR sections in documents you're submitting to court, you may be required to cite to the official print version of the CFR and the Federal Register pages on which any final rule promulgated before the next printing of the CFR would be. You need to be aware of this caution. Remember, the official version as published by the GPO is available on govinfo.gov website. But for everyday normal use, the language found in e-CFR is very trustworthy, and I use it in my research at the reference desk. We are using the new beta version of the e-CFR at this URL that you see, the e-CFR.FederalRegister.gov. The e-CFR we previously used was located at www.ecfr.gov. That webpage may still be available, but we want to make sure that you knew the new beta site as well. Okay, let's talk about authority notes. So now that we know the language in our section, 29 CFR 1630.1, and we know that the language has not changed since the last printing of the CFR back in July, we can turn back to our CFR print pages to do more research. So I want to start with something that we get asked about at the reference desk, which is the question, why is the agency allowed to issue this regulation? Who gave the agency the authority to do that? The answer is found in the enabling or authority statute passed by the US Congress. As I mentioned earlier today, for a federal agency to issue a regulation with the force and effect of law, it must derive that authority from a grant of power by Congress via statute. To find the specific statute in which Congress authorized an agency to promulgate a regulation, you have to look to the authority note connected to your section or part of the CFR. You can typically find an authority note at the beginning of a larger unit of the CFR, such as a part and or a subpart. The citation is typically printed just after the initial table of contents listing of the sections contained in that part. And it includes the word authority. On the screen, on the left side, you see that CFR page contained our part and our section, 29 CFR 1630.1. And highlighted in the orange box and blown up in the little pop-out window is the authority note. It tells us the statute or legislation that gave the Department of Labor, through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the authority to promulgate these rules can be found in the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended, which is found in Title 42 of the United States Code in sections 12116 and 12205A. So that is the enabling or authority statute in question. So for more information about the US Code, again, if you're interested, we do have a federal statutes webinar you can take. All right, source notes. The other piece of information that researchers typically request and that we want to explore today is how to determine what changes have been made in this regulation over time. In other words, how do I trace this regulation back in time to determine when, how, and why the regulation was created and why any changes might have been made? A regulation's source notes will provide breadcrumbs to get us started on this search. Specifically, they tell us about the final rules as published in the Federal Register that gave us rise to or amended an existing section of the CFR. Sometimes people call this tracing the regulatory history of a CFR section, similar to when people research the legislative history of a statute. So where do we find these source notes? A general source note typically appears at the beginning of a larger unit of the CFR, such as a part or subpart. If any amendments to a particular section have been made or a section has been added at a later date, a source note will appear in brackets following that section. Why would there be more than one source note? Because an agency might have created an entire part within a title of the CFR via a final rule, and then later determined that the language of a section included within that part needed to be changed. Thus, they could have returned at a later date with another final rule amending the language in just that section. So you might need to know about the original language of that section as it was initially created and also the changes made in the later amendment. The scenario I described is what happened with our regulation, 29 CFR 1630.1. Looking at the right side of the screen, we again are looking at the text of our CFR section. The orange box on the left side of the document follows the table of contents for our part. It is the source note for our part, and it is referring us to a citation found in volume 56 of the Federal Register on page 35734, dating from July 26 of 1991. But keep looking and you'll find another source note at the end of our section. 1630.1. This source note is highlighted in the orange box on the far right side of the document. It's referring us to the citation for the history of an amendment to our section found originally in 76 Federal Register, page 16999 for March 25, 2011. These source notes are typically leading you to that regulation's final rule publication in the Federal Register. and specifically to the page where your section appears. On this slide, I've repeated the explanation of the two source notes in our situation. I've included a blown up view of that source note so you can read the text better. The source note for the entire part is found at the top, starting with the word source in all the caps. And we find the reference to volume 56 of the Federal Register and page 35734, where we'll find that final rule as published in 1991. Lower down on the screen again, you see the text of the Federal Register entry for the changes or amendments that were made to our section in the year 2011. All right, so back to our chart. So to figure out how to look up these final rules in the Federal Register, we have to take another step back in our notice and comment rulemaking process chart and talk about the Federal Register and how to find information in it. As we've discussed earlier in this presentation, the Federal Register is a daily publication that deals with actions of the executive branch of the federal government. Each print copy of the Federal Register will have its date of publication and will be a snapshot of agency action on that day, including notices of public meetings, for example, proposed rules, and final rules that administrative bodies released on that day. It also includes presidential executive orders. So this is a daily publication, and within it, the contents are organized by agency. It is a chronological publication. So let's look at a citation. In this example, we're using again the Blue Book citation style that I mentioned earlier. Here I'm using the final rule we found referenced in the source note after 29 CFR 1630.1. First, you'll see the title of the regulation, Regulations to Implement the Equal Employment Provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended. After the title, you'll see a volume number for the Federal Register of Interest. Ours is 76. Because the Federal Register is laid out chronologically rather than by subject, we'll be citing to volume numbers rather than title numbers. Another difference in Federal Register citations is that you're pointing to pages within a volume rather than section numbers. Here, the page numbers are showing you the page on which the final rule begins, 16977, and then the page on which the text of your or our CFR section of interest can be found, page 16999. Next, you'll see a note about the date the Federal Register issue came out, March 25, 2011. And finally, you'll see a parenthetical note telling you which section of the CFR is being created or amended. And as you'd expect, this is our section of interest today, 29 CFR 1630.1. We're going to see what these pages in the Federal Register look like in a moment, but first I want to talk about how to find it online. The good news is that you can find all copies of the Federal Register online for free. Recently, the Government Publishing Office released all copies of Federal Register from its beginning in 1936 to the present on govinfo.gov. They're available in PDF format. You can also access them from the Law Library of Congress's free online collection, 1936 to 1993. If you have access to a subscription database as listed, for example, Hein Online, Westlaw, and Lexis, you can do that. But I want to focus on the other two free resources I've listed here, FederalRegister.gov and Regulations.gov. FederalRegister.gov is a very helpful page to use if you already have a citation to the Federal Register for issues published in 1994 to the present, because you can enter the citation and be taken directly to the rules Federal Register page. And then you can download PDF copies of the print pages of the Federal Register where the rule appears. We'll look at that in a moment. Regulations.gov does not have the search by citation ability of FederalRegister.gov, but it is helpful for finding agency docket information related to a rule, such as public comments submitted about the proposed rule, town hall transcripts, and more. We'll look at that later. Okay, So FederalRegister.gov offers PDF copies of the Federal Register from 94 to the present, but it enhances the material by allowing you to search by citation, subject, and/or agency and keyword. We can also set up email alerts on your searches so that you're warned when something happens on your search results. Here is the homepage of FederalRegister.gov. You can search for material or browse to material. Starting at the top of the page, you'll see an orange box around the toolbar at the top. It contains a Q search button and a search documents box. Additionally, in the middle of the screen is a global search box where you can enter your citation or keyword. If you prefer to browse by date or agency, name, or topic, you can select the Browse button on the toolbar at the top of the page. Locate regulations by assigned index terms called topics. For example, maybe animal welfare or apricots. Via the Browse menu at the top of the page, then select Topics C.F.R. indexing terms, or via the Explore Topics C.F.R. indexing terms option in the bottom right corner of the page. If you get confused while on the site, you can use the Reader Aids button for more help. They have videos and tutorials. Here is an example of the Browse by Topic page on FederalRegister.gov. The agencies have applied topic headings to their documents. You can select a topic from the alphabetical arrangement. They include topics from barley to banking regulations or hazardous waste to wildlife refuges. To see proposed and final rules on a certain topic, just click the linked topic on the right-hand side. You can also search the topics by keyword using the topic filter search box on the left-hand side. Next, I want to show you some search results, but my screen is hovering and not moving forward at the moment. Bear with me. Sorry about that. I knew we'd have to have some technical problems. All right, I'm going to try to unshare my screen and reshare and see if that solves our problem. Bear with me. I'm going to attempt one more time. Okay, my colleague Barbara is going to try to open the PowerPoint on her end, so bear with us. All right, I am unmuted and I see FederalRegister.gov sample research results from my colleague, I do believe. And I am going to keep talking unless I hear someone tell me that I am not there. Okay, great. Thank you, Barbara. Here we go. So now I want to show you what it looks like when we have a known Federal Register citation that we search with. On the screen in the find box, you'll see the citation I entered, 76 FR 16999, into the global search box on the home page to pull up the results page. Remember, this is the final rule from 2011 related to our C.F.R. section that we found in a source note. Notice that the website is asking me if I want to open the rule page for my rule of interest, even though the page number I gave was for the page on which the language showing how section 1630.1 is amended, not the first page of the rule. This is very helpful to the researcher. So I am going to take their suggestion and go to 76 FR 16977, which is the first page of the final rule I'm seeking. If you were doing a keyword search rather than citation search, I could use the filters on the left-hand side. All right, looking at our sample rule page, having selected that Federal Register, this is our first page of the final rule that I was seeking. Here you'll see information about, on the left-hand side, under the agency, we see that this was from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Under action, it tells us whether the document we're looking at is a notice, proposed rule, or final rule. Ours is a final rule. Under summary, we get a brief paragraph or so summary of the rule, and then the text of it. Looking to the right side of this screen, you'll find a link to a PDF copy of the print pages of the Federal Register. The page range of the document in the Federal Register, in our case, it was that large 41-page range starting at 16977. You'll see the citation to the section or parts of the C.F.R. being changed. And I want to draw particular attention to some of the numbers listed here on the right side of the page, including the RIN and the document number. All right, moving forward to important information in the Federal Register. You'll likely see that these three numbers listed, document number, regulation identifier number, or RIN, and docket number. Okay, what are they? Document number is a unique number assigned by the Office of the Federal Register to each document published in the Federal Register, whether a notice, proposed rule, or a final rule. The document number for our final rule is 2011-6056, assigned by the Office of the Federal Register. Next are the RINs, or regulation identifier numbers. They are a unique 8-digit code made up of two 4-character groups separated by a dash, which started to be assigned to each regulatory process around the year 2000. It identifies a specific individual regulation under consideration. It is assigned by the Regulatory Information Service Center. And finally, the docket number, or docket ID, which is assigned by the agency promulgating the rule, links all of the docket information for one regulation via this number. I think of the docket as a big file folder or box at the agency with the proposed rule, any notices, any public comments, transcripts of public meetings, petitions or reports submitted or created by the agency, etc., sitting in it. And this docket number is listed on the top of the box. The docket number is assigned by the agency promulgating the regulation, as it identifies the document within the agency's internal filing system. So again, it's assigned by the agency who made the rule. If you are going to do docket research, write down both the RIN and the docket number so you have them ready if you're asked for them. So let's see where we can find these numbers and other information about the regulation in the print copy of the Federal Register. Here on the screen, you see the PDF image of the first page of our final rule, which starts on page 16977 of our volume 76 of the Federal Register. I know the print is small, sorry about that. But here I want to show you what it actually looks like. Starting at the top of the page, you can see the volume, page, and date information for the Federal Register. Working our way down the page, starting on the left side of the screen, you see information about what C.F.R. part is being amended. Again, our 29 C.F.R. part 1630. The RIN for the regulatory process is posted there, and the title of the final rule. Below that, you see the name of the agency issuing the rule, again, EEOC, and the action, final rule. This should all sound familiar. We were looking at this a minute ago on FederalRegister.gov in an HTML format. Next, you see contact information for the individual at the agency who is in charge of this rule. This is important to know in case you have any issues finding docket information for the rule or have questions in the future. Next is the beginning of what we call the preamble to the final rule. The preamble starts with a history of the regulation, including information about the proposed rule, also known as Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, that was previously published in the Federal Register. You can use the citation here to find the NPRM in the Federal Register if you want to go back to that original regulatory language proposed. In our situation, it's referring us to the proposed rule that was published in the Federal Register on September 23rd, 2009 at 74 FR 484431. Okay, and continuing on, turning the page in our Federal Register example, this is the next page in our volume. Continuing in the preamble, we see a section called Summary in Response to Comments, in which this agency talks about the comments they received from the public after publishing that notice of proposed rulemaking. The agency will typically provide the total number of comments, but they will likely not address each comment in detail. Instead, they will group comments based on the topic, issue, or theme they discussed. They will summarize the comments on each topic and talk about why they did or did not change the language in proposed rules based on those comments. Next, you will see a citation to the docket number. In our case, that gives us the number you need to find these comments in the docket file at the agency that promulgated the rule, again, the EEOC. Moving forward, let's go back to our chart of the notice and comment rulemaking process. So now, after reading the preamble to the final rule, we have information about how to find the notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register and the docket information attached to the rulemaking process with the docket number. And here is, and I realize I only have 3 minutes left, so I will be going a bit quickly, but bear with me, folks. So next, we're going to look at the Regulations.gov webpage, which actually is one great place to look for that docket information. Regulations.gov was created to promote public involvement in the rulemaking process by allowing people to draft and submit their public comments directly on the website and by allowing people to access scans of docket information directly from a regulations landing page. You'll see the let's see, most agencies participate in regulations.gov. However, some national security and military administrative bodies do not. For more information about what agencies don't participate, you'll see the link provided on the bottom of the slide. And going forward, we're going to look at a screenshot of regulations.gov here. It recently revamped its look, and you will find a video and introductory information on the website if you'd like to get an overview. Much like FederalRegister.gov, you can do a keyword search or browse. One thing I want to note, however, is that unlike FederalRegister.gov, you cannot simply enter a Federal Register citation and be taken to the notice of proposed rulemaking of interest. Instead, I would suggest using the information we found in the preamble of the final rule to do searches. For example, you could use the RIN number or the docket number in the global search box that you see on the screen. Next is a screenshot of a search result. So we used our RIN in the global search box, and this is what we see. There are 3 types of items organized into the tables. There are dockets, documents, and comments. I can narrow the results by the facets on the left side of the screen. The facets will vary depending on the type of material you are viewing. I selected the document type of proposed rule. And on the next screen, we see what that would give us. Here we're viewing the notice of proposed rule. Much like FederalRegister.gov, it gives me information about the notice of proposed rulemaking and the text as proposed in the Federal Register. Of particular interest is the comments section that is linked on the left side of the screen. And here we see a screenshot of that comments. Those were all submitted on the proposed rule. For the comments submitted online, the text is linked, and for comments submitted via mail, a PDF scan is actually attached. Finally, you can search across the full text of all comments submitted by keyword which can help you if you're only interested in what people had to say about a specific aspect of a proposed rule. Are all the comments available on Regulations.gov? No. Agencies review all submissions. However, some agencies may choose to redact or withhold certain submissions or portions thereof, such as those containing private or proprietary information or appropriate language or duplicate, near duplicate examples. And this qualifying language is explained in more detail on Regulations.gov. Now we are seeing a screenshot of a sample docket page from Regulations.gov. And again, you can explore this in the future for more information about other types of materials an agency would hold in its docket file. Why don't we go ahead, that's an example of how to submit a comment. Few additional resources that you can access at any time in the future on regulations. And finally, I think we are at, yes, bingo, 12:01. Sorry for running to the last minute, but I want to make sure you have the Ask a Librarian form if you have questions. And I don't see any questions posed in the Q&A box, but if there are questions, one of my colleagues can verbally tell me. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending today's session. We appreciate your patience with our technical difficulties. And again, when you exit today, hopefully you will receive a pop-up exit survey that we hope you take the time to participate in and consider attending a future webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.